Yes, the Bible is full of exciting stories about normal people who are called to extraordinary tasks, and we'll look at some later. But first, let's look at some other famous crossings. Can you name the three ships in this painting? What river is this in the painting? How is your knowledge of American history? Look closely. This maps the Oregon Trail, which crossed the western wilderness from St. Louis to the Pacific coast. Charles Lindbergh was the first to cross the Atlantic from New York to Paris in a solo flight in 1927. The flight took 34 hours. And now the big question is, did it make it to the other side? Okay, now let's get back to some from the Bible. It might be a good idea to jot some of these down because later on we'll be looking at some of the examples that some of these would show. So when I list them, we'll give you a little bit of time to maybe jot them down. So let's get started. Now back to crossings in the Bible. Take a moment and think of some. Here's some that I came up with. Abraham, leaving Haran to, as God would put it, to a place I will show you. Moses going back to Egypt after watching sheep for 40 years. Israel crossing the Red Sea. Israel crossing the wilderness. A trip that should have taken only 11 days but took 40 years because of disobedience. Joshua leading the Israelites into the Promised Land. And then Ruth leaving her homeland of Moab and going with her mother-in-law into a new country, Israel. And then the disciples crossing the Sea of Galilee. This was a rough trip. You may want to pause the video at this point and maybe make a list of these because I'll be referring to them a little bit later on in the video. What are some things that you can say about any of these crossings? I think all of the mentioned crossings fit this first one. The crossing may be bumpy, difficult, and a struggle. The crossing needed faith. You could put faith in all of them too, but not at the same level. The crossing needed obedience. Even though the Israelites disobeyed at first, they needed to learn obedience to survive. The crossing may involve a promise. Not all had a promise to start, but God had his hand in the journey. And the crossing may regard testing, which may prepare us for the destination. Struggles will occur along the way. The crossing will probably contain surprises. Not all of us like surprises, do we? The crossing will involve spiritual growth. That comes with obedience and faith. And the crossing will involve following directions carefully. Not doing so can cause a problem in the crossing. Some of the Israelites learned to follow directions the hard way in gathering of the manna. We may not know the destination. This is where faith comes in. Most of us like to know where we're going before we start. We may be leaving something bad, and that's good. And we also may be leaving something comfortable, and that's where it becomes more difficult to be obedient. We may need to completely disconnect from the past. This could be good or difficult, depending on our past. And we may question and doubt the move. Moses did this repeatedly until he knew God had had enough of his excuses. Crossings may contain temptations, yes. Crossings may have failures, ups and downs, and they certainly will. Crossings should develop a greater knowledge of God, and crossings should develop a greater dependence on God. And crossings are meant to change us, and they will. Part of the reason for the crossing is to prepare us to touch the lives of others. That you may not realize until a little bit later on down the road. Another reason may be to remove something from us, whether we like it or not. And sometimes one crossing may prepare us for another. Not all journeys have just one crossing. And the neat part is these struggles can be our testimony. Crossings usually involve the unknown. If not, why would we need obedience and faith? Some crossings start with an invitation, and others start with a command. Why did Jesus not tell the storm on the sea to bypass the disciples in the boat? What do you think? They were out there, fishermen, used to being on the high seas like that, and yet they were really frightened by the storm. What was Jesus trying to tell them? If you look at the story, you'll find out more than that. And you see, show and tell works much better than just telling. And Jesus knew that. He wanted to show them who he really was. Remember, the earth is not our real home. We're just passing through. Our individual crossing here on earth is different for each person. So don't try to force your journey onto someone else. Jesus calls us to walk away from unfruitful attachments of the past so we can step into the future he has for us. We may not realize this for some time, but later on down the road it may become clear. Abraham's crossing was from the known to the unknown. Israel crossing the Red Sea was to deliver them from Egypt, and that was successful. Israel crossing the wilderness was to remove Egypt from them, and this one had some tragic problems. You see, they readjusted their rearview mirror and saw Egypt with rose-colored glasses rather than the oppression that they were really experienced. Stinking thinking can hinder forward progress. Just remember, the windshield is bigger than the rearview mirror, and they were looking in the rearview mirror. Joshua and the Jordan involved obedience. The ark went first, and others followed 1,000 yards back to signify sacredness. It will be bumpy. The disciples actually had 2 rough crossings on the Sea of Galilee. Crossings mean testing, and they are designed to equip us for what we will need on our arrival to the other side. So, speaking of the other side, part of the reason you've passed through all that you have is to prepare you to touch the lives of others. Don't squander this. This can be very helpful for other people. Our struggles can be our testimony. There's no testimony without a test, and some moaning. Get it? Testimonies are diamonds developed in the intense pressure of trials, pearls formed by irritating grains of sand that won't go away. You must win the battle over who or what defines you, and allow God to be the definer of who you are. Look at the story of Moses and how he tried to talk God out of using him to lead Israel out of Egypt. Also look at the lineage of Moses. According to Hebrew family, Moses was not the son of a first son. He wasn't even a first son himself. Also, taking a look at Joseph, David, and Gideon in the same way. You see, Satan wants to define you by your past. God wants to define you by what you can become. So, what do we get from all this? Okay, how about a time of reflection? If you've heard God's call, what has been your response? Fearful or excited? As you approach the other side, do you have a hunch who is waiting on the other side? And what do you sense God has been teaching you that will be part of your testimony to them? You may want to play back the last time of reflection and ponder over those questions. Maybe in another time on your journey, you may want to play this video again because you'll have more insight into the crossings in your life. So until the next time, signing out again.